Now that you're familiar with the elements of a story, let's explore them in depth. When it comes to the plot of a story, the most important aspect of it is conflict. Conflict is a struggle between opposing forces that the characters must confront. If there is nothing to overcome in a story, then there is no plot, there is no story. Conflict in the story is what creates the plot and it drives the plot forward. They say that in all of literature there are only 4 kinds of plots. Man versus man, of conflicts in a plot, Man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self, and man versus the system. Or you could talk about conflict as internal conflict and external conflict. External conflict refers to the obstacles that a character faces in the external world, and internal conflict refers to the character's emotional or psychological obstacles that he or she must overcome. Then there are moral or philosophical obstacles that are created between a character's worldview or their beliefs in the system or their beliefs in philosophy or religion or the world around them. In a plot, conflict is important because it creates the plot and it drives the plot forward. It reveals opposing beliefs and truths about life, and it entertains the reader by creating relatable contexts in emotional, dangerous, or exciting ways. Another element of a good story is a central premise. A premise is the basic point of the story or the basic truth of the story. For example, the premise of a story could be that power corrupts, or that bad people can be turned to good or rescued or saved. Or it could be something that is not entirely true, like good is the same as evil. The point of everything in your story is to build a case for this premise. And by the time the audience reaches the end of the story, they should get this point. Sometimes stories have 2 premises, or it might be a premise in 2 parts. For example, in the movie Star Wars, or in the Star Wars series in general, the premise is that one part of the premise is that power corrupts, and the second part of the premise is that goodness can redeem the corrupted. And it is this dichotomy or this 2-part premise that makes the story so satisfying. Characters in your story can have their own premise as well. This comes across mainly in the form of things that they believe are true about themselves or about the way they look at the world around them. It defines their convictions and their desires and their beliefs, and all of this can ideally be summed up in a few lines in your character's description. For example, you might have a character who truly believes in telling the truth or is a hard worker, and that is a central aspect of who they are, or it's their basic premise. In such a case, if this character were to suddenly violate their premise, for example, this hardworking character starts to slack off for no reason, or the extremely truthful character suddenly starts to lie, we suddenly feel a disconnect between their actions and what they have told us about themselves. And when this happens in a story, it is usually it can be a bad thing if done carelessly, because it can come across as a sign of poor writing, or it can seem very contrived, or it can be a good thing if you set it up in such a way that the character departing from their basic premise is a way of showing the audience that the character was deceiving themselves. It could be a part of their psychological conflict that they're trying to overcome. Either ways, in general, a good rule of thumb is to establish central premises for your characters and to have your characters stick to their basic premise. While your premise answers the question of what the story is all about, you also need to have a strong rationale for why the plot is happening, or why the events of the story are happening to these particular characters. For a story to have a chance at making a point, it has to eliminate unwanted details and focus on the overall settings and on one group of characters who have a good reason for being there. There has to be a believable feeling of reality in your story, and it's difficult to induce that if the wrong people show up in your story, or if your setting is out of place, or if your reader starts to think, why is the story happening here, why are these characters here, why are they saying the things they say, or why are they doing what they're doing, or what's so special about this time, this set of events that seem to be happening, right? So as long as you have a plot, you also need to have a good reason for why that plot exists, and what fuels, and that is what fuels the reason and logic in the world of yours. When we talk about characters, you need to have a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist is your main character, the main vehicle through which the audience experiences your story, and the protagonist, in terms of their character, has to be somebody with some redeemable or likable qualities that justify why they are the hero of your story. Your protagonist needn't always be the good guy. In fact, it can be quite engaging and quite impactful if your protagonist is flawed and is someone that struggles with certain moral or certain dilemmas and succeeds despite all of that. When you're writing a protagonist, you must consider the following things. One is that your protagonist must be the person in the story, or the character in the story, that most wants the end goal to occur, or this is the character who has the most amount of drive to achieve whatever is the objective of your story, and this character is the one that is willing to work the hardest for it and to sacrifice the most for achieving that particular end goal of your story. And the protagonist must have a growth curve. They must start out with certain flaws and deficits, and over the course of the story they must grow and evolve and eventually become worthy of being the protagonist and achieving the objective of your story. Now, also make sure that while we said that flawed characters are powerful, your characters must not be too flawed or too annoying or too despicable. They must have some redeeming quality, and you must at some point get the audience invested in that redeeming quality of theirs, because otherwise the audience will not believe that the character is worthy of being the protagonist or the hero. And also the protagonist has to be someone who's willing to work hard or endure a lot of things in order to make the end goal of your story happen. Because if your protagonist is someone who gets things too easily, or if there is the struggle isn't big enough, the audience will not buy into it, or they will not root for such a protagonist to win. One last thing to keep in mind about when you create protagonists is that they needn't be one person. A protagonist can also be a group of people working towards a similar goal. For example, you'll see that in fantasy novels or in young adult fiction, you have, like for example, the Fellowship of the Ring, or you have the characters from Game of Thrones, where you have multiple protagonists all working towards certain goals, and that definitely makes for very interesting storytelling, even though it is particularly challenging to write a group of protagonists rather than just one protagonist. Along with the protagonist, in terms of characters, you also need an antagonist, or a character who is bent on stopping the hero or your protagonist. Now note that I'm not using the words hero and villain, rather protagonist and antagonist, because when we look at modern storytelling, our stories are not just about the good guy versus the bad guy. It could be about two kinds of bad guys. It could be about so therefore you have a main character who wants to achieve something called the protagonist, and you have the antagonist whose job it is to get in the way of the main character and to prevent them from achieving their goal, and thereby creating the conflict that drives the story forward. Now, usually when writing a story, the antagonist is either made out to be overtly evil, which makes it too easy to wish for the protagonist to succeed and the antagonist to fail. If your hero is extremely good and your antagonist is extremely evil, then the conflict between them is not as intense, because it is quite obvious that the good character has to defeat the evil character. However, when you have well-written antagonists, this is somebody who makes it really hard for you to choose sides. There are stories where you do not know whether the protagonist has the right of it or the antagonist. And these are the more nuanced and more powerful stories that you see. Even your antagonist must have a strong and justified and even noble reason for why they're doing what they're doing. Oftentimes they have very human kind of flaws which overtake any redeemable qualities that they may have. For example, they might have too much pride, too much greed, but they must have a very relatable and very understandable reason for why they are opposing the protagonist of the story. While creating an antagonist, here are some things to keep in mind. One, they have to have a reason for why they are being bad, so to speak. The antagonist must stand in the way of the hero, in not just in what he's doing, but also in terms of his or her psychological makeup, their wants and desires. All of this must be in contrast to what the protagonist of your story is. The antagonist often, in fact, the best antagonists always have a soft spot or a human side, something that some sort of weakness for being good in some way. This is what makes us connect with them, and this is what makes it really hard for us to choose between the protagonist and the antagonist. Your antagonist cannot be entirely evil, because that is not believable at all. Similarly, the antagonist in your story must grow the same way that the hero does. They must also have a character development, or they must also have an arc of growth through adversity and struggle, because the antagonist in your story cannot get stronger or cannot become stronger in their obstruction of the protagonist's path if they also do not grow. The antagonist can also doesn't necessarily have to be a person. It can be a powerful concept or an idea, and it can be the source of moral conflict, or it can be the source of conflict between man and nature, or man and the system. Another important aspect of a good story is to have character development. You need to have strong three-dimensional characters who change over time. We mentioned early on that a story is the telling of how a character's situation changes from good to bad or bad to good. Now, as much as this kind of an arc is necessary in the plot, it is also necessary for the growth of a character. If your character remains the same at the beginning of the story and at the end of your story, then that does not come across as a very engaging or an interesting story. The audience starts out blank as the story unfolds. They learn more about the main characters as you go along, and what they learn and how they get a sense of the character's personality That's what we call character development. Now, if done well, the audience comes to quickly understand who your characters are, and based on this understanding, they will be able to either root for your characters to succeed or, hope for them to fail. The effect of creating a character in the minds of the audience is it's the hardest part of creative writing, because characters only reveal themselves during the course of events, and that's all that we can really work with. You can let your characters be quiet, aggressive, thoughtful, stupid, or evil as the events of your story unfold. Now, if your characters behave according to their underlying premise, and they reveal themselves properly, and it happens over the course of your story, then people will be able to understand them, they will be able to emotionally engage with them, and they will be able to really invest emotionally in the plot. So these were some basic elements of a story, and this can universally be applied to short stories, novels, films, graphic novels. Now, as an assignment for this class, I'd like you all to take some time to think about your favorite story. It could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a graphic novel. I would like you to take some time to think about the elements that you've learned today and apply them to the context of your favorite story, and try to deconstruct your favorite story and understand the plot, the theme, the characters, the conflict, the central premise of the story, the motivations of the protagonists and the antagonists, and we shall discuss all of that in our next class.